Okay, shall we get started? So buongiorno, welcome back everybody for the first session on the Friday morning on Buddhism. I'm Erika Baffelli from the University of Manchester, and I will be chairing this session. So we have Emma Tomalin as our speaker and then two discussants. So I just briefly introduce Emma and then I'll give the floor to her. So Emma Tomalin is Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds in the UK. She's a sociologist of religion, and her main research interest is focused around religion and global development, religion, gender and society. One of her recent projects was a large international project called Hidden Pace Builders Network. And I just mentioned one of her recent publication, which is the Routledge Handbook of Religion, Gender and Society, that she co-edited with Caroline Starkley. And without further ado, I won't take up any more time, and Emma, the floor is yours.
Right, that's my one. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're not all too tired after yesterday and the meal last night and everything. Great. Now I can hardly see you, but that's okay. Okay, so yeah, I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks, Roberto, so much for the invitation. So my paper's going to be on Buddhism. So Buddhism is today considered to be one of the major world religions. And it originated in northeast India, or in what is today northeast India, around 2,500 years ago, and spreading across most of Asia in the decades and centuries following the death of the Buddha. However, others view it as a way of life or a practical philosophy that is deeply woven into the culture of many Asian societies rather than a religious tradition. And we heard quite a lot of this yesterday, particularly when we were talking about Confucianism and Taoism, whether this label or category of religion or world religion actually fits very well. So the fact that many don't see it as a religion, particularly the case given its rejection of the idea of an omnipotent creator God, and the fact that many who adopt a Buddhist worldview in Asia and engage in Buddhist practices don't actually view themselves as members of an organized religion. But more recently, from the 19th century, Buddhism began to spread to the West as part of the European colonial encounter and through immigration. In contrast to other Indic or Dharmic world religions such as Hinduism, Sikhism or Jainism, which in diaspora settings have remained predominantly practiced by immigrant groups and their descendants, Buddhism has attracted greater numbers of Western converts. So this Western encounter with Buddhism has been significant in shaping its construction as a world religion, as well as its characterization as a religion of peace and equality, to be contrasted with other traditions that are often perceived to be more likely to lead to war, conflict, and inequality. But an examination of what we might call lived Buddhism actually indicates a much more varied picture, where a spotlight can be shone on ingrained traditions that promote, for instance, gender inequality, as well as, we find examples of Buddhist monks engaging in acts of violence, for instance, in the conflicts in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka. Oh, sorry, okay. Right, let me move over here just a little bit. Okay, so I'll begin this presentation by looking more closely at the origins and spread of Buddhism, as well as some of the key changes over time. And this will be followed by a discussion of its contemporary global distribution and an analysis of statistics relating to Buddhist demography. And then I'll conclude the paper with a discussion about recent or current debates in the study of Buddhism in two broad sociologically themed areas. So I'll look at the application of Buddhism to social and political issues, and this is usually sort of taken to be under the broad banner of what's been called engaged Buddhism. And I also want to then look as well at the relevance of Buddhism for identity politics and the contemporary culture wars, where in particular I'm going to focus on gender and race. I just want to say a little bit about this picture on the slide here. This is one of the Triratna Buddhist centres in London. It's the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green, and it actually used to be in an old fire station, which is why you can see those sort of classic red doors. And I think this is quite sort of emblematic of the way in which Buddhism has adapted to many Western settings. And I did a project with a heritage body, Historic England, about 5 years ago, where we looked at the way in which different Buddhist traditions, so both those that have developed in the West, but also those that have come from outside, have adapted and taken over existing buildings in England in order to establish places of worship. So I've got some slides later on with some more examples. Okay, so according to Buddhist tradition, Siddhartha Gautama, the founder of Buddhism and popularly known as the Buddha, is considered to have been born in what is modern-day Nepal, near the border with India in a town called Lumbini, to parents from the royal Shakya clan, sometime in the 5th or 6th century. And you can see here the map where it outlines, I hope you can see it okay, Lumbini, where he was born, and then Bodh Gaya, where he had his enlightenment experience, and Sarnath, where he gave his first sermon. So the dominant religion in that region at the time of the Buddha was Brahmanism, led by the Brahmin priests who presided over the elaborate Vedic ritual sacrifice, and whose tradition was transmitted in the Sanskrit language. So the Brahmins were the highest social class in the social hierarchy of the time, which comprised the 4 varnas or classes. And these also included the Kshatriyas, the warriors or the leaders, the Vaishyas, the merchants, and the Shudras, which were the servants. And the Buddha, he belonged to the Kshatriya class. Alongside Brahmanism, which began to develop into what we now know as Hinduism by about 200 BCE, there existed different renunciate groups or sects that influenced the development of Brahminical religion, but also which presented alternatives to it. And this included the Samanas, of which Buddhism was one. So according to tradition, the Buddha had led a very sheltered life within his royal family. And he was brought up to avoid contact with human suffering. And despite his very sheltered upbringing, the story tells us, the tradition tells that eventually he became aware of the existence of aging, sickness, and death, and made the decision then to leave his family, to become a renunciate, to understand how humans could escape the pain of the human condition known as dukkha in Pali. So he sought out the mentorship of different teachers and methods of realization, and after becoming so weak from ascetic practices, he took some food, and as the culmination of his efforts, he had his awakening or his enlightenment, sitting under the Bodhi tree in a place now called Bodh Gaya in modern India. And he became the teacher of what's been called the middle way, so between the extremes of attachment to sensory pleasures and asceticism. So following his enlightenment, the Buddha began to attract disciples and established a community of monks, of bhikkhu, which is the Pali word for monks, and shortly afterwards of nuns or bhikkhuni. And taken together, this was understood or known as the Buddhist Sangha. And while the monks and nuns renounced the world and lived in monastic communities following strict rules or the Vinaya, they were reliant upon the lay community for their existence. And the ideal arrangement became what is known as a fourfold Sangha, consisting of monks, nuns, lay women, and lay men. So the Buddha spent the remainder of his life wandering in the Ganges basin, spreading the Buddhist teaching or the Dhamma. So I'm now going to look at some key changes in the spread of Buddhism. So this slide here shows you with the arrows where Buddhism spread from its sort of origins in northeast India over time. So as Buddhism developed, different schools emerged, of which 2 are in existence today, the Theravadan and the Mahayana. The oldest existing Buddhist texts were written down about 200 BCE in Sri Lanka and are known as the Pali Canon, and they reflect the Theravadan school of Buddhism, which today is found in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar. And Mahayana Buddhism began to develop around 100 BCE in India, and its texts were originally written in the Sanskrit language. And Mahayana Buddhism then spread throughout South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, and today is prominent in China, Mongolia, Hong Kong, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Nepal, Taiwan, and Bhutan. So it's quite different to some of the traditions we were looking at yesterday with Taoism and Shinto, which are very much concentrated in a particular location. By contrast, religion from its very early days was involved in this process of becoming a world religion, if you like. So Buddhism began to spread across the rest of India and parts of Asia as early as the 3rd century BCE, beginning its journey to becoming a world religion. While by the 10th century CE, it was in steady decline in India. Before it more or less disappeared from the Indian subcontinent, it had spread to other places across Asia, taking on features of local cultures and folk religions as it expanded. So it changed. The texts were translated into different languages. Buddhism absorbed and took on different elements of local folk religions and cultural traditions as it spread to different locations. So, even within Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, the two main schools, there are very many different varieties and practices and ways of dressing and so on. It's a very varied religion. So another major episode in the journey of Buddhism to become a world religion has been its encounter with the West that began around the 19th century. And this was not initially the product of direct contact with Asian Buddhists, but instead from the writings of Orientalist scholars in colonial settings. So people like Brian Hodgson, Eugene Burnouf, Caroline Rhys Davis, and Edward Arnold, whose poem, The Light of Asia, published in London in 1879, brought Buddhism to a new audience. And I've got the front page of his book on the slide here. However, the version of Buddhism that they transmitted through their translations and writings was filtered through a Western lens and comprised, according to Chi, a re-representation of Buddhist philosophy and religion that emphasized individualism, freedom, and the rejection of superstitious practices. The interlocutors in Ceylon, in particular, were complicit in the shift to focus on a textual Buddhism, where the Theravadan texts were constructed as the original form of the tradition in the Pali language that represented the teachings of the Buddha as a rational system of philosophical thought, devoid of ritual, magic, and superstition, in favor of meditation, which they regarded as the hallmark of Buddhism. So this new form of Buddhism that developed as a result of the encounter with the West and is now the dominant form in the West has variously been called Protestant Buddhism or Buddhist modernism. And more recently, some scholars have argued that this current era of thick globalization, the binary between Western and Asian Buddhism no longer holds. Instead, as Halafoff and Rajgopal argue, the growing intensity and reach of transnational interactions brought about by travel, technology, including the connections and exchanges made via the internet and social media, demonstrates that for the binary opposites of tradition and modernity, the West and the rest are no longer applicable to contemporary Buddhism, but rather plural modernities are evident, entangled in the interplay of global and the local. And they refer to this form of Buddhism as ultra-modern Buddhism. So by the late 19th century, many Europeans and Americans were very frustrated with Christianity in particular and had begun to seek alternatives. Now, two of the most prominent individuals involved in spreading Eastern religions to the West were Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky, founders of the Theosophical Society. They travelled to Ceylon, which is present-day Sri Lanka, in 1880, and while they were there, they apparently thrilled the Sinhalese by becoming lay Buddhists in a public ceremony. So one of the first Asians to bring Buddhism to the West was a protege of Olcott's, who's here in the photograph, a Sinhalese Sri Lankan man who became known as Anagarika Dharmapala once he became ordained. And he was also invited as a delegate to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. And in fact, that's where that photograph was taken, was the people that were gathered at the World Parliament of Religions. However, at this time, there were already Buddhist Asian immigrants in Western countries, but they were relatively segregated from the main populations, with shared religious spaces and personnel only emerging at a later date. For instance, Chinese gold seekers and indentured workers had brought Buddhism to the USA, arriving in California in the mid-1840s. In Oceania, the story was similar, where the first Buddhists to arrive in Australia and New Zealand were most likely Chinese workers in the goldfields in the mid-1800s. And that's a picture of some Chinese labourers working in the goldfields in the USA. So in Western settings, these early immigrants were joined by others, so economic migrants and refugees in the post-colonial and post-World War II period, from countries such as Thailand, Myanmar, Tibet, Nepal and Vietnam. For instance, Tibetan lamas came from the 1950s following the annexation of Nepal by China, and Vietnamese arrived escaping the war there from the 1970s. And this led to the setting up of temples and Buddhist centres that serve as places for religious practice, but also culture and language. And again, these are some sort of pictures from the project that I did with Historic England. So we have Samu Ling Temple, which is a Tibetan temple in Scotland. Wat Buddha Padipa, which is a replica of a Thai temple, which is in Wimbledon in London. And we have the London Buddhist Centre in the fire station again. And then the final one here is a Burmese Vihara in Birmingham. So a real sort of combination of Buddhists taking over existing buildings, but also building buildings, places of worship that very much in the style of the temples that they find back home. So while some Buddhist temples and centres are more likely to be attended by members of particular ethnic groups that brought their version to Western settings, so for instance, the Sri Lanka Sinhala temples are very much focused around Sri Lankan culture and language, other styles of Buddhism have developed that attract both Asians and Westerners. So for instance, the Thai Forest Sangha and others that have followed, and others have a following of mainly Western converts. So for instance, Triratna, which used to be called Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and groups like the Tibetan Yukadampa tradition. But also in the 20th century, there was a growth in transnational Buddhist organizations such as Soka Gakkai and the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana tradition that focused on spreading Buddhist practices across the globe, as well as others such as Suchi and Sakyadhita International Association of Buddhist Women that focused on social and identity issues. So since the late 1990s, the internet has also played a huge role in the spread of Buddhism globally and the strengthening, in particular, of Buddhist social action, where alliances have been formed across traditions, as well as strengthening and resisting authority structures that marginalise certain groups, including women. So I'm now going to look at some statistics. And we also heard a lot yesterday about how unreliable statistics are for all kinds of reasons, but particularly when we're thinking about Asian religions, where people often don't consider themselves to belong just to one religious tradition. So countries which have a high concentration of Buddhists, so at least 50% of the population, include Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Laos, and Mongolia. Countries with at least 10% Buddhist population include Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, China, Macau, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Northern Mariana Islands, and Nepal. And the Mahayana tradition is today the largest globally. So according to 2008 figures, and this is the pie chart here, 56% of Buddhists apparently belong to the East Asian Mahayana, 6% to Vajrayana, so the Tibetan version of Mahayana, compared to 36% for the Theravada tradition. And according to the Pew Foundation, about 7% of the world's population was Buddhist in 2015, and this is expected to fall to around 5% by 2060 due to low birth rates among Buddhists. About half of all Buddhists globally live in China, according to 2010 figures, but they make up only about 18% of the population. East, South, and Southeast Asia make up most of the rest, where 13% of global Buddhists live in Thailand. and Japan, where 35% claim to be Buddhist. Even though Buddhism has spread to the West and other locations, including Africa and Latin America, only about 1.4% of Buddhists reside outside Asia. And as I just said, statistics about Buddhist populations can be very misleading, as they assume that people can only belong to one religion. But by contrast, in many Buddhist settings, including East Asian countries such as China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and Malaysia, as well as in Chinese diasporas, people practice Buddhism alongside other traditions, including Taoism, Shinto, and folk religions, with many people who do not identify as Buddhist actually engaging in Buddhist practice and with Buddhist philosophy in their daily lives. So this suggests that the actual number of Buddhists exceeds that gained from surveys, which assume people only practice one tradition. So in the second half of the paper, I want to now turn to consider some recent or current debates in the study of Buddhism in two broad sociologically themed areas. So first of all, I'm going to look at the application of Buddhism to social and political issues under the broad banner of what has been called engaged Buddhism. And then I'm going to look at the relevance of Buddhism for identity politics and the contemporary culture wars, where I focus on gender and race. And particularly in selecting these areas, I've taken the Buddhist encounter with the West as my starting point, and in particular its journey towards becoming a world religion and how this has shaped its modern manifestations. So, engaged Buddhism. So part of the process of the emergence of Buddhism as a world religion has been its construction as a religion that has strong social ethics based on compassion, equality, and inclusivity, and is naturally inclined towards peace. And this is often held to be in contrast to other religions, which are viewed as lacking genuine commitment to inclusivity and equality. So, for instance, some forms of Christianity and Hinduism, or are prone to conflict. This moral framing of Buddhism and its application to solving social and political problems is part of what has been called engaged Buddhism, a movement within global Buddhism where the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who there's a picture of him here, was the first to use the term apparently in 1963 in the context of his experiences during the Vietnam War. I mean, this isn't to say that Buddhists weren't already responding to social and moral issues prior to these. So, for instance, we have Dr. Ambedkar's movement in the 1950s in India to convert Dalits to Buddhism to escape from the caste system. But I think from this period, Buddhism began to gain its reputation as a global religion, uniquely placed to provide solutions to the world's problems. And this has included a wide range of topics, including environmental issues, peace building and humanitarian response, operationalized through organizations, and I've put some of their emblems up here, such as the One Earth Sangha, Buddhist Global Relief, the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and Zen Peacemakers. So there's lots of examples of these kinds of organizations that are very actively engaged in social and political movements. So those who argue for engaged Buddhism, and there's a bit of a debate here, do this against the backdrop of a perception that Buddhist traditions are too otherworldly and disengaged from the social problems that people face, with their emphasis on monastic life away from the troubles of the world. Instead, they argue that social action and engagement has to be seen as the authentic expression of a Buddhist commitment to liberation from the suffering of human existence, with engaged Buddhists in both Asia and the West more likely to be lay members of the tradition. While some view engaged Buddhism as going back to the time of the Buddha and depict him as a social reformer, others argue that the Buddha and his successors were not social revolutionaries in the modern sense, and that its practitioners often think and act differently from their predecessors in Buddhist history and literature, where they stress collective responsibility towards challenging harmful social and political institutions. While most scholars and practitioners use the term engaged Buddhism to refer to examples where causes are pursued that would be viewed as improving people's lives in the direction of greater equality and in recognition of human rights. Fuller, for instance, argues for a broader conceptualization of the term, where it refers to Buddhist groups, movements, and individuals who apply Buddhist ideas to tackle inequalities, problems, injustices, political and social structures in ways that might not meet with general approval. He argues that we should not just use the term to refer to those who pursue passive and peaceful agendas. He argues, and to quote, that engaged Buddhists can be on the wrong side of history, supporting genocidal regimes or standing in the way of social progress. The primary focus of engaged Buddhist movements is that they understand social action as a primary feature of religious practice. So in response to portrayals of Buddhism as, for instance, inherently environmentally friendly or peaceful, some scholars have argued that these are modern interpretations to suit a particular agenda and don't fit with either interpretations of the texts or evidence from lived religion. So, for instance, with respect to environmentalism, Darlington, for instance, has pointed out that on account of the Buddha's focus on transcending this world, it is understandable that his teachings do not focus on, much less romanticize, nature. Rather, early Buddhist texts are openly hostile to the environment. In the Digha Nikaya, for example, Buddhists are thus told to generate a distaste for the world because it is impermanent. And as Elveskog writes, we need to recognize not only that Buddhism is not an inherently environmental religion, but also that in pursuing power and profit, Buddhists in particular have historically exploited the natural world. But Darlington argues also that although it's clear that there was no conscious environmental ethic in early Buddhism, she argues that question is not relevant today, as Buddhism itself has evolved in its new setting and is being used today to refer or to deal with many different social issues, including the impacts of environmental degradation. And I just put one sort of really well-known example here on the slide of the ordination of trees by monks in Thailand. This also happens in Cambodia, where a monk's orange robes are tied around large trees to denote the mutual dependence of people in the forest as a focal point for environmental projects. And similarly, with respect to peace building, commentators have criticized the idea that Buddhism is an inherently peaceful religion, with evidence from its earliest times of involvement in war and conflict, where before the 1800s, conflicts were steeped in millenarian and revolutionary rhetoric, while in the post-colonial period, as nation-states formed and transnational influences increased, Buddhist-inspired conflicts became more influenced by issues such as nationalism and identity conflicts. The ongoing conflict in Myanmar between Buddhist nationalists and the minority Rohingya Muslim ethnic group has brought this apparent contradiction between an idealized Buddhist pacifism and evidence of violence acted by Buddhists, including monastics, to the fore. Foxius, however, suggests that this is far from incongruent, where a recurrent view in many Buddhist traditions is that wherever the Buddha's dispensation, the teaching, is perceived to be in danger, acts of intolerance or discrimination, and even violence and warfare can be regarded as justified to defend Buddhism against its enemies. This defense is what is perceived to justify, for instance, the contemporary Burmese nationalist movements. So the existence of violence in Buddhist traditions has also been highlighted by recent work on what's been called spiritual abuse. Most likely as a response to the Me Too movement, there have been several recent studies looking at abuse scandals within Tibetan Buddhism, particularly with respect to the lamas or teachers Chogyam Trungpa and Sogyal Rinpoche. This topic has also been taken up in the current research of two female scholars based in the USA, Anne Gleig and Amy Langenberg, who, as part of a larger project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation on religion and sexual abuse, are currently writing about sexual violations and US convert Buddhism. Langenberg and Gleig have also written about the experiences of the abuse they have received, largely delivered online for their work, where their views have been questioned on the basis of their identities and credentials, and where some critics have either sought to normalize sexual abuse within Buddhism or to argue that survivors of such abuse were not really Buddhists after all. And as I discuss in the next section, this kind of interaction that they've experienced, this negative, abusive feedback about their work, has been made possible by social media and are a feature of what I'm calling the modern culture wars, where identity issues have become increasingly polarized. So a feature of engaged Buddhism has been its response to a range of social identity issues, including gender and race. These issues have been taken up by scholars and practitioners, as well as scholar practitioners who straddle both camps and exist against the background of what has been called the culture wars. And this is a term that was first popularized in the early 1990s by sociologist James Davison Hunter, who used it to describe the deep-seated tension that had emerged in the US between orthodox and progressive worldviews, where culture wars tend to be described as being fought on one or more fault lines. Buddhism is often associated with a liberal demographic, according to Gleig. Right-wing sentiments and populations in American convert Buddhism, she argues, are increasingly in evidence, where American convert Buddhist lineages have become a site of the culture wars, with long-standing clashes between religious conservatives and progressives playing out in multiple contexts across the US. But today we see these culture wars not only played out in US contexts, but globally, where different views on gender and race are frequently invoked by opponents. So the study of gender and Buddhism has predominantly focused on how Buddhism views women and the extent to which they receive equal treatment to men within the tradition. But the perspectives differ, with some arguing that Buddhism is gender neutral, as anyone can obtain enlightenment, to those who draw attention to the lived religion, to how things actually are in practice, where women continue to experience discrimination. For instance, in some traditions, they are not permitted to take full ordination or may experience different forms of abuse by male religious leaders in powerful positions. As is common within Western scholarship on religion, until the influence of the second wave of feminism was felt in the 1960s and the 1970s, little attention was paid to women's experience of Buddhism compared to that of men. As Kim Gutschau outlines, on the one hand, Buddhist studies have often proceeded as if the history of men in Buddhism stands for Buddhist history, with little effort made to mention or recover the significance of women. On the other hand, systematic methodological choices, such as the discounting of feminist analysis and the privileging of text over other sources of knowledge, have exacerbated the tendency to elide the role of women in Buddhism. And she continues that in Buddhist analyses, male or man is assumed to represent human, reflecting the fact that most scholars of Buddhism in Asia, as well as in the West, have been men. And this is, of course, despite the work of female scholars such as Caroline Rhys-Davids, Mabel Bode and Iselene Blue-Horner from the late 19th century. They were pioneers in translating and writing about some of the earliest Buddhist texts that portrayed women's religious experience and were written by, about, or concerning women, the best of which is the Therigatha, which is a text which dates back to the time of the Buddha, part of the Pali Canon, and it contains beautiful poems about the lives of Theris or elder Buddhist nuns. In the 1970s, the gap in scholarship about women and their religious traditions has been recognized, and texts began to appear around women and Buddhism. This reflects broader trends in the feminist study of religion, which sought to address the reasons for women's marginalization in religions and the wider impact that this had upon their social roles and to offer solutions that drew attention to women's marginalisation and which drew on resources from within the tradition. While the earliest academic texts on women in Buddhism mostly emerged from the earlier Orientalist tradition, including Horner's Women Under Primitive Buddhism, first published in 1930, and translations of the Therigatha, the first publications with a feminist inflection began to emerge in the late 1970s. So this was texts like Rita Gross's Beyond Androcentrism, Nancy Falk and Rita Gross's Unspoken Words, Religious Lives in Non-Western Cultures, and the amazing work that Kamalekshi Somo has done within Sakyadhita, the International Buddhist Women's Organization. And since the 1980s, there's been a rise in interest in texts about women in Buddhism from a feminist perspective, including from Asia as well. So now Asian women are also prominent within the literature on women and feminism and Buddhism. So a large focus of the literature on women and Buddhism has been around women's ordination. Although the tradition of full ordination for women is still strong within the Mahayana traditions, it doesn't exist in an unbroken lineage within Theravada or Vajrayana traditions. And this is not least to do with the belief that it's necessary, if a nun wants to get ordained, that she has to undergo what's called the dual ordination, where it requires the presence of both bhikkhunis and bhikkhus. So nuns and monks have to be present. And of course, if the lineage of nuns has died out, it's not possible then to have nuns present to carry out the ordination, to carry out the dual ordination. There have been ingenious ways of reviving this, though. So the bhikkhuni ordination was revived in Sri Lanka in 1996, where it took place with support from Taiwanese bhikkhunis, Mahayana bhikkhunis, as it was demonstrated that they could trace their lineage back to the same lineage as the Theravada nuns. But this has not been accepted in other Theravada settings, such as Thailand, or in the Tibetan tradition, where women are only officially allowed to ordain as novices. Although the official reason given for the rejection of the revival of women's ordination is because it's inauthentic, as it's taken place within a different lineage, we can also, or others would also argue, that this is a version of the culture wars, where the reason given is a smokescreen used by men within the tradition who want to preserve their male leadership as it works to their advantage. And this, there's some pictures of some book covers, but also a picture here of the Buddha's aunt or stepmother, Mahaprajapati, who was the first Buddhist nun to be ordained by the Buddha, and she began the Bhikkhuni Sangha within the Buddhist tradition. But women have also waded into the culture wars critique of the revival of the Bhikkhuni ordination, with some object to the capture of this topic by white Western Buddhist converts who are portrayed as seeking to impose their colonial feminist views on Asian Buddhist women and nuns. While some argue that there is no need to revive the Bhikkhuni ordination and that Asian women or Asian nuns are satisfied with their novice status, others have objected to the labelling of female renunciates as feminists, so they see this as an external term that doesn't have relevance within their context. For instance, Nirmala Salgado, writing about women's ordination in Sri Lanka, is critical of the dominant scholarly narrative of nuns connected with the larger politics of identity and conceptualised in terms of liberal discourses and Western feminist categories. She points in particular to the role that the International Buddhist Women's Organization, Sakyadhita, has played in promoting the debate about and the revival of the Bhikkhuni ordination. She characterizes it as a group that promotes a Western feminist perspective that universalized the female renunciate in Buddhism, where her supposed empowerment is conceptualized in terms of her acquiring access to higher ordination and material resources. So this post-colonial critique is also racialized, pointing to the increasing awareness in Asian Buddhist traditions of how the encounter with the West has shaped the global Buddhist experience in ways that marginalizes Asian voices. And this has led to a critique of the structure of knowledge production in Buddhist studies, and the need to rethink how the study of Buddhism is done and who's invited to participate in that activity. So, for instance, this includes thinking beyond a focus on texts and carrying out more research on lived Buddhism, as well as facilitating the promotion of Asian scholarship in different languages, so as to broaden understandings of Buddhist belief and practice beyond the narrow canon of what is typically considered as authentic Buddhist studies, as typically carried out by Europeans and Americans. As Castro writes, Buddhist studies on the whole has not acknowledged, let alone addressed, issues of colonization, white supremacy, and the erasure of Asian people and cultures within the field. She argues that within the practice of Buddhism in the US, for instance, there's a long history of white communities, of convert Buddhists, appropriating Buddhism by excluding Asians and ignoring the cultural aspects of Asian Buddhist traditions. More recently, studies have begun to emerge about the experiences of Asian Buddhists in the USA, whereas Chi argues the neglect of the racialization of Asian immigrant and Asian American experiences have reproduced or reinforced Orientalism in US Buddhism. So Han's book, for instance, challenges stereotypes of Asian Buddhists as Oriental monks, superstition immigrants, and banana Buddhists. And McNichol has pioneered research on Black Buddhists in the USA. So I'm now just going to sum up and conclude. Oh, I don't have another slide. I'll go back to that one. So my aim in this presentation has been to present an overview of Buddhism in the past and today from a sociological perspective. So I began by looking at its origins, its spread and key changes over time, followed by a discussion of its contemporary global distribution and an analysis of statistics relating to Buddhist demography. And in the final part, I introduced a discussion about recent and current debates in the study of Buddhism in two broad sociologically themed areas. So firstly, the application of Buddhism to social and political issues under the broad banner of what has been called engaged Buddhism. And secondly, the relevance of Buddhism for identity politics and the contemporary culture wars, where I focused on race and gender. This, of course, leaves out much about contemporary Buddhism that is of interest sociologically and adopts a broad brush and global perspective rather than focusing in on recent or current debates which are relevant to particular Buddhist settings. But a few things stand out to me from what I have included in my discussion. So first of all, the Buddhist encounter with the West has influenced the construction of Buddhism as a peaceful and egalitarian religion that contrasts with a view of some other world religions as violent, unequal, and prone to harmful authoritarian structures. Second, and linked to this, Buddhism has attracted much higher numbers of Western converts than the other Dharmic religions, where these presumed passive and egalitarian qualities appeal to the individualistic and liberal mindset of many Western truth seekers. Despite this appeal to Westerners, it has, however, been predicted that Buddhism is likely to decline over the next 30 years or so due to a falling birth rate in Buddhist countries. Third, the growth and development of forms of globally engaged Buddhist is also linked to the perception that Buddhism has tools to offer those seeking solutions to many of the social and political challenges facing the world today. However, some scholars are pushing back on what they see as a normative view, where engaged is equated with socially progressive agendas, and instead argue that we also need to consider and be researching forms of publicly engaged Buddhism that are at odds with the liberal consensus. And finally, some scholars and practitioners are seeking to think about ways of studying and practicing Buddhism that are inclusive and decolonial in order to challenge the power inequalities that exist within the academic study of Buddhism, as well as Buddhist institutions. So while I focused on gender and race in my discussion, another area of focus that's been gaining significant interest is regarding LGBTQI+ issues in Buddhism. So the elevation and the experiences and perspectives of groups that have been marginalized within Buddhism and wider society is a really key feature of contemporary Buddhism that is likely to shape its trajectories over the next decades. I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for this overview and reflection on recent development in the study of Buddhism, but also for being perfectly on time. Yes. So we now have the first of our discussant is Raphael Liogier. I hope I didn't butcher your name too much, from the Institut d'études politiques. And I have to ask you to sit here because it's the only place where the people online can see you.
So thank you for this talk, and many things have been said. So in a way, I don't know what I could add to what you have said, because it gave us obviously a very broad general perspective on the evolution of Buddhism in general in the world, and also the evolution of Buddhism in the Western world and the Western conceptions and misconceptions. So you almost said everything. So instead of criticizing, I rather focus on specific points that I'll try to develop. And of course, it's always what we do. I will focus on specific points that I have worked on specifically, because it's much easier. So I try to focus on one point in particular that is for great interest, I think. At least it has been for me, I will say, in the first part of my career, because for the first, I would say, 15 years of my career, I've done some survey on Buddhism, on Western Buddhism in general, and in particular in France. And what I discovered, and in fact, it's also related to what you have said, but I will try to be a little bit more, I don't mean precise, but a little bit more detailed. And it is the idea that Buddhism is, in a way, the ideal type. And I know that usually when you use, on the Weberian point of view, ideal type, that means that it doesn't express itself in reality because it's just an ideal type. But in the case of Buddhism, it's strange because it seems like it is a caricature in itself of what I'm about to say. So it's an ideal type expressed in the real world, which is quite interesting. An ideal type of what I call the post-industrial westernized religion, completely reconstructed, almost completely reconstructed. And first, it's interesting to say, first reconstructed in Asia by Asian people themselves, which makes it interesting. And it was actually the subject of my dissertation, to show that it wasn't reconstructed here, but it was reconstructed there. So when people think they go there in Asia to find what is more authentic, what they find is actually something that is already reconstructed as being supposed to be authentic, for different reasons that I will not develop, but in particular the fact that Buddhism is the only, you were talking about identity, is the only religion, tradition that was at one time or another present everywhere in Asia, even if it is not anymore, or almost not anymore, in India. It was at one point, of course, because as you said, it was born there. It was in China, it was in the south, in the north, even in Indonesia, even if it's not anymore today, in Japan, etc., etc. So when Western people came over, a way to resist the frustration, the complex of losing everything in front of the power of Western people, they saw that somehow some of them admire what they thought as being Buddhism. So they constructed some kind of a new transnational identity all over Asia to fit into the eyes of the people that will colonize them. So they became more, we are rational, we are that. You think you are rationality, but in fact, we are the root of rationality. Buddhism is the root of rationality, etc., etc., etc. So it's a caricature of what I call in my work spiritualism, and I will come back to that in a short. Spiritualism, another definition of spiritualism is what I call religion as non-religion, which is typical of our time. What I mean when religion as non-religion, a religion is supposed to have a belief system with transcendence. In Buddhism, we have that. I mean, the transcendence of Buddhism, it's the first sentence of the Dhammapada, which is the heart of the heart of the heart of the text. Like, everything is mind. Everything is mind. I mean, it's transcendence to say that everything is mind. Second, it has to have a religion, a soteriology, as we call it in philosophy or sociology or anthropology of religion. So a theory of salvation. There is in Buddhism. Nirvana in some texts, body in other texts. You have to have specific collective and individual practices. There are in Buddhism plenty. Not only meditation, vipassana, or shamatha, or mantras, or everything. You have everything. Fourth, you have to have an organization with specific rules, moral rules, etc., etc. You have that. You have one of the most, structured organizations in Buddhism. Maybe I would say more than in other organizations throughout Asia, specifically in Tibetan Buddhism, but not only in Tibetan Buddhism, actually. Also in the South, also in Theravadian Buddhism, even related to politics, as you show in Thailand and in Burma, we know all about that. But, interestingly, you'll have a discourse here, multiple discourses, not all of them, but multiple discourses that will say, oh, in Buddhism, there is no transcendence, even no belief. What does that even mean? So it's the belief that there is no belief. That's a very interesting belief. The second point is no salvation. What does that even mean to say that? Well, in fact, even the same people that say there is no salvation, they actually implicitly pursue many kind of what we could call salvations, what I've tried to show in my work. Third, no rituals. No rituals in Buddhism when you... Strange. And even no institutions. What is great with Buddhism is like it's not institutionalized. It's so great. But it's not. It is institutionalized, and even it is institutionalized there, but it is institutionalized here. And my colleagues here, Lionel, Obadia, has worked a long time ago on institutionalized Buddhism and all those institutionalizations in details. He did. So, oddly enough, sometimes some sociologists believed the Western Buddhists when they interviewed them and when they said all those kind of things. And they didn't see that these spiritual, discourses from the Buddhists is part of what we could call spiritualism as a dogma, as something that is mainly the dogma. So they have to say that. What is a dogma? There's some kind of a pressure, like even a pressure to be seen, to be visible in the community or elsewhere, to be spiritual. So if they will say that, it's in order to be seen as real, authentic, pure Buddhist, typical religious word. To be pure Buddhist, you need to pretend that you're not looking for purity. But in that case, you are really a pure Buddhist. So we have to, I think, pay deep, I don't know how. Great, that's fantastic. You're so generous. Yeah, I love that. So you will have all those discourses that will express themselves in different ways. For instance, I've a complete list, but just some of them. No, it's not a religion, it's a simple philosophy. Or it's wisdom. Or it's very fashionable. It's the more fashionable. That's the reason why I kept it from the last. It's a science of the mind. Very interesting. And in fact, what interests me is that it's not only to say that it is reconstructed, but to try to understand from what point, from where it is reconstructed, from what specific social and psychological needs and uses it has to say these kind of things, that it is a science of the mind, etc. And I found in my work different reasons, sometimes opposed reasons. Example, an old Marxist, Maoist, and I have seen plenty of them, so very materialist, pretending atheist, that in the same times has some kind of a middle life crisis about finding meanings, and he feels bad to have been too Maoist and have seen what the Chinese have done to Tibetan in Tibet, etc., etc., etc. He engaged himself in association to help Tibetans, and in the same time, he became a Buddhist. And at first he said, oh, it's only political. And when you interview him and you have an appointment with him at his house, and it's a real thing that I'm telling you, you arrive, and he's a little bit late because he's doing his mantra in front of bodhisattvas, like kind of divinity. And when he tells you, he repeats you that he's a Marxist, he doesn't believe in anything, you say, so what is it? Oh, he says, oh, no, it's nothing, don't pay attention. It's a psychic metaphor. It helps me. I mean, I'm doing like some kind of a spiritual psychoanalysis of myself. So what do you need? Those mantras, those specific mantras, that just helps. So it could be something else. Yes, of course it could, but still it is that. It could be something else, but it's not something else. Yeah? So what is it? It is just that it's a way to answer a potential cognitive dissonance, as say psychologists. So he is practicing a religion, but he needs this religion to look like it's not a religion, because otherwise it will look like he will betray the first part of his life, being a Marxist, being rationalist, etc., etc., etc. It's very interesting how it reconstructs this way, how Buddhist has, I will say, a social and psychological use, very useful to do that. The second case you have is, for instance, a Christian priest, and I'm really saying a Christian priest, a Jesuit in this case, but now we have many of them, that is not satisfied with the way he practices his Catholicism and all that. He needs more. He needs more than he feels some kind of a gap to feel. So he starts to practice, in this case, Zen Buddhism. But he really practiced for a while, so he goes to Japan, he does many things, and he became, so to say, a Zen, Rinzai, priest. But it's not possible theoretically. And he has to choose. Is he a Buddhist Zen priest, or is he still a Jesuit? No problem, because he will discuss with his hierarchy in the Catholic Church, explaining that it's not a religion. So saying that he's a Catholic priest and in the same time a priest is, no, it's not really a priest. He has a master that he follows, and he has received all the sign, the symbolic sign of the Zen priest. But no, it's not a religion. It's something else. So it allows him to do both, pretending that it's not what it is. Interesting, You'll have that also, but it's a little bit more complex, and I know that Lionel has worked on that, so I'm not going to walk on his, maybe on his talk. It's about Jubu, Jewish Buddhist. I must say I have discovered that almost randomly. One day, I had an interview. I was interviewed by an American journalist that was in France, interviewing people that were working about 20 years ago, working on Buddhism in the West. And when he introduced himself, isn't being a journalist, he said, I'm also a Buddhist, but a special Buddhist. I'm a Jubu. You know what I mean? I said, no, I don't actually. It's just, and he explained me what it is, and I studied it a little bit afterwards. And I think in a different, even more complex manner, as I said, I will not extend on that subject. Then with the Christian priest, it's structurally about the same, to answer some kind of a cognitive dissonance. That it's possible. If you say, oh, that's spiritual, that's a wisdom, that's etc., 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 easy, I don't have to betray the fact that I'm Jewish, and I'm a real traditional Jewish in a way. It may be even more traditional than others, because Buddhists helped me to rediscover, rediscover what is really a Jewish religion, etc., etc. You have also other patterns, like I remember in my work the pattern of the ancient Catholic traumatized by the Catholic boarding school in his youth. So he doesn't want to hear anymore about institutions, just the word. It just makes him feel bad. So when he's practicing his Buddhism, because he needs something, again, he feels the gap, the typical gap that we talked about. And so he said, it's not an institution. Really? I mean, where are you going? What is your, I mean, you have a card, you are part of a very strict institution. No, it's not an institution. Okay. If you want to call it something else, it doesn't matter, fine. When you interview people, you don't get on their nerves because it could become dangerous. So, in fact, this reconstruction, as I said, to summarize, is first, is here to feel preconceived Western beliefs. One example is energy. For instance, belief in energy, and so you make it, no detail about that. Second, it's preconceived practice. One of the practice is the idea that you need to visit different traditions and rites, etc., to know yourself, to improve yourself, to enter in the real meaning of every religion that is hidden in a certain way. And what is interesting in this way is it's kind of there is some kind of a competition in different type of religion to pretend to be the religion that is the closest to the supposed to be original religion, that is of course only peace, love, nature, and all those very post-industrial belief. And so you have, for instance, more recently, some kind of a competition between neo-shamanism and Buddhism as being the one that is the most authentic, pure heart of religion, in the thing. And the third, it's answers, as I said, specific needs. For instance, engaged Buddhism is typically the need to engage, or individualistic needs to improve oneself. So all that fits perfectly into what I called individual globalism, the fact that you need to go global, but you need to go global to improve yourself. And when you stay on your own in your room, in fact, you go global. That's why I call it individual globalism. And it's some kind of a new theater stage. And like in stage, in a theater play, you have three main themes: the theme of self-knowledge, the theme of creativity, the theme of holistic health, of well-being. But what is very interesting, it's that those different themes, they are supposed to be, how can I say, that be the training of the other. For instance, if you show creativity, of course, you are healthy. Of course, you have self-knowledge. If you're supposed to have self-knowledge, you have to be healthy. For instance, you have talked about Tibetan groups, and there was many problems. I mean, cognitive dissonance problem after the death of, for instance, a famous Lama. If he died of cancer, it's like, how come that he died of cancer? I mean, he practiced meditation so well, so he had self-knowledge. If he has self-knowledge, of course, he is in pure health, So like if it weren't possible to have one without the other, which is completely out of the tradition. It doesn't, but here it's created. And the second thing, as I said, it's like a theater stage. These new mythology, these new individual globalism. So in a stage, there are settings. And so there are three settings: hyper science, hyper tradition, hyper nature. If I use hyper, the Greek hyper, because hyper means more than. So Buddhism is supposed to be, I'm finished. My last sentence. Could you give me that? Great, that's great. Thank you very much. So hyper tradition, that means it's supposed to reflect a tradition that is more than any tradition. As I said, like the original tradition of all traditions. And it's more pure, more visible in Buddhism, so therefore Buddhism is great, is better. Now I tell you it's a little bit also with shamanism. Hyper science, it's supposed to be already scientific. I mean, if you read the books of the Dalai Lama, they show that the Buddha was already an expert in quantum physics, for instance. So it's more than science. It's a science that was already there, just discovered by our pure rational science that just discovered it so late that it was already done, etc., etc. And hyper nature, of course, with the idea of ecology. And it's more than nature, always more and more. And Buddhism is specifically, specifically from this reconstruction that all those things, all those phenomena could appear and develop, like eco-Buddhism, ecofeminism, engaged Buddhism, etc., etc., etc. So I will say it's my real very last sentence. It's a laboratory of everything that is happening in traditional religions in the West, the tendencies that are inside it, that work is at stake, and the new religious movement. It's just at the intercourse and the interaction of all that. And it's why I think it's very interesting still today to study Buddhism in detail. Thank you.
Some exercise. Thank you so much for bringing the discussion with some thought-provoking comments. And I'm calling out our second discussant, Lionel Obadia from the Università Lumiere, Lyon 2.
Thank you. Well. It's pretty difficult to go after Raphael. And 25 years ago, there were only 3 men doing some fieldwork in Buddhism in France. And we were young, we were handsome at the time, and we were crossing our roads, and now still we are crossing the road. Thanks a lot for, but you are much more a sociologist than I am, because I am an anthropologist. And I had the chance to start fieldworks in Buddhism in France, and after my journey brought me to Israel in the early 2000s to study Buddhism and New Age movement there. And after a while, this is a strange journey for an anthropologist. I came to start fieldwork in Nepal among the Tibetan communities, and I ended up as an ethnographer of South India, but this is another story. Well, two scholars then. Thanks a lot for this really impressive historical reconstruction of the past of Buddhism. But I have, good cop, and I am the bad cop. Now I have some critical points to address in a very sociological terms. But in your oral presentation, there are much more elements to focus that I find in the text. So some of my criticism may be a bit out of place. I apologize for that in advance. Then first, you focus on Buddhism as a world religion. And of course, I will ask you, what do you mean by world? The fact that there is a Buddhist conception of world in symbolic terms, in theological terms and philosophical terms. And what is the world? Is Buddhism in the world? Buddhism for the world? Means that ideologically sound and echoing some kind of points that you raised, Raphael, in your talk. Or Buddhism throughout the world means the globalization of Buddhism. And the very issue of being a world religion brings me to Max Weber, and I will get back all along to Max Weber and the very concept of universal religion. The second point is that you raised the sociological issue regarding this historical account. But I remember that in 1998, Yann Nattier in the US framed three main processes. One, she said, mission. The second was diffusion, and the third was migration. And you pinpoint all those three processes, but they act in parallel in spreading Buddhism. But to a certain extent, they intermingle, they inflect and influence each other. And I would like to have more details and more discussion about these three processes, because, of course, missionary Buddhism is targeting a Western audience, and migration is supposed to be a so-called ethnic or Asian Buddhism only. I rely upon Chuck Prebisch's division in between white and Asian Buddhism. Of course, this change that you underlie or put emphasis on, Raphael already put the question, so it's quite difficult to come after, but does the source of these changes come from the West? And you seem to put emphasis upon this one, but of course, some of this process of Buddhist transformation came beforehand in Asia. And it will bring after to the very idea of Buddhist modernism. If we get back to the first sentence by Henri de Lubac in 1952, then modernism, Buddhist modernism, is a purely Western thing. But if we come to Hans Bechert's 1984 definition, this was a purely Asian process. So my question is how these two modernism, or these two theories of modernism in Buddhism, or modernity in Buddhism, or Buddhist views of modernity mix together and crisscross. Of course, this change in Buddhism also are, for those that who have been working in Buddhist studies, can come from internal factors, for instance, schismatic theological issues, and very specific to the changes and the shift between Hinayana forms and the later Mahayana forms. And in your slides, you make a difference in between Vajrayana and Mahayana, but for some scholars, it's not that sharp in between the two. So on the one side, what is related to internal factors, for instance, purely ideological or theological, and external factors, I mean economic, sociologic, political, and so on. And you put emphasis upon the political things, which is good. And I will not bring you to this field, I will bring you elsewhere. The journey of Buddhism, you also, I will be just a bit critical, but this is just for discussion. He said, in the West, but my question is, what is the West? And one philosopher even stated, where is the West? And regarding the moral geographies and the imagination of the West can be a state of mind, the West can be an imagination, and the West can be a geopolitical location. Especially since the issue of Orientalism is as the counterpoint of Occidentalism, the way exactly that Asian create some kind of visions about the West and the way that they have to modernize, and the very specific pathway of Japan as a modern but not westernized country is really interesting to that extent. Do I have time? All right, the variety of Buddhism, and I'm really glad to hear that you take into account the very specific complex features of Buddhism, since Buddhism is not just text and monks and the organization. I rely, for instance, about the tripartition by Melfort Spiro, about Buddhism in Burma, Nibbanic Buddhism, Karmic Buddhism, and Magical Buddhism, but also Gambridge, you mentioned Gambridge as well, ascetic on the one side and lay on the other side, or Donald Swearer in the 80s that said there is a practical Buddhism on the one side and scriptural Buddhism on the other side. So Buddhism is a very, very complex thing, and you know that beyond languages, schools, traditions, location, this is very, very difficult. And this is also something that you pinpoint in the issue of demographics. Issue that was raised by Thomas Rice Davis in the late 90s. That was the first attempt to address the issue of demographics of Buddhists worldwide. And Thomas Rice Davis said the pure Buddhists are only 1% of the people claiming to be Buddhist. It means that they are fully engaged in the Buddhist systems, and the rest is mixing. So in my own work, to be a bit selfish, but just a few seconds, it brought me to the very critical attack and assault against the issue of bricolage, which is a common wisdom of modern society, modern sociology, and said, okay, everything is bricolage. But bricolage is a feature of Asian religiosity, and Max Weber told this already in what he called the Asiatic character, the character of Asiatic religion in 1920. In the religion of India. Combining, altering, changing is something that is traditional and widespread in Asia, and is absolutely not a modern invention, or not in these terms. Of course, the main issue of the transformation of Buddhism on secularization on the one side, and you pinpoint this part, and hybridization, thanks Raphael to mention that I've been working in the encounter and the intermingle and the identity changing between Judaism and Buddhism, and we even settled a seminar in Oxford last year with was us from Israeli University and Sebastian Munch from the University in Germany, and we gathered 25 young and not so young scholars specialized in the field, and it was quite impressive how this hybridization process brings about new forms of mixing religion and new theories and new conceptual challenges. Not to mention race and gender, because you already dig into this part. I just want to add to the political issue, the issue of sectarianism and the issue of cults, because there is kind of stigmata on specific Buddhist group that you mentioned. For instance, Soka Gakkai and New Kadampa tradition are supposed to be sects within Buddhism and for governments in Western countries. But there are only two main points. In addition, I would like to add to the reflection and for a dialogue on the change of Buddhism. First is, you talk about politics and you talk about gender and you talk about racial issues, but what about economics? Indeed, on the grounds of the global extension of modern capitalist systems, the economic issues are turning to be a central key point to this discussion in the transformation of religion. We all agree on that. All groups, church of organization, are nowadays subjected to the market structure, branding strategies, business models, spirits of enterprise, and individuals are affected by new cultural backgrounds, changing their attitude to symbolic goods and salvation practices. We witness a commodification of religion and Buddhists, especially in the case of Buddhists. This is really impressive in the diffusion and consumption of yoga and meditation. So there is a kind of economic turn in the sociology of religion at the time, and Buddhism is in the age of market, and marketization, of course, is really important, since there is on the one side, the movement of so-called Buddhist economics, means the Buddhist values against the capitalistic system, and on the other side, the marketization and the commodification of Buddhism as a symbolic good in the new market economy. So these are two very important things I would like to underscore here. And of course, this should only add to the political factors and the historical aspects. The second one is technology. we live in digital times as well, and the digitization of societies affect all religions and all kinds of societies and culture. And the global and unescapable wave of colonization of digital devices, tools, media, Buddhism is far to remain unaffected by that. The very concept of hyper-dharma and cyber-sangha have been framed 20 years ago in the rise of this movement, and I would like also to mention that my last field work is working on the religious robots and AA, and there's a lot of things to say about the very close relationship of Buddhism to new technologies with regard and in contrast with our other traditions. For instance, Japan and China are the not only but main countries where religious robots are framed nowadays. And I'm working with an Italian Catholic guy named Gabriele Trovato, who is framing, he's building some kind of religious robots in Japan. So, not to mention the borrowing of Buddhist symbols and concepts in the hyper-modern techno-cultures, you know, that these virtual cultures with cosmic narratives and so on that you can find online. All these elements surfacing in the aesthetics and semantics of global cultures compelled for the our largest possible from whom endeavors to tackle the challenge of describing and analyzing the contemporary transformation of Buddhism. Of course, this is not a real criticism, because it is quite difficult to size some very, very recent and some very, let's say, quick and widespread movement. And we know that the rhythm of science is also always in kind of delay in the social movement and the movement of history. But it sounds to me important to add to the political issue and to the cultural issue the very challenging topics of economics and digitization. And that's it.
Perfect timing, thank you. So I would now like to invite Emma if she wants to give a quick response, and then we can open the floor for a few questions. Spoken again.
Musical chairs.
Because I was stepping today.
Thanks both for the reflections, and also, you know, the way that you've both sort of built on what I presented. I mean, I think both of you brought up this issue about sort of Western Buddhism, and you in particular, the question of what I meant by the West. I mean, first of all, maybe this nuance needs to be brought out a little bit more in the paper. I by no means intended to imply that the sort of recent changes in Buddhism had all been the impact of just the West on Asia, that it's a much more interactive process, you know, with some of these processes and trajectories perhaps already being in place, you know, but at the time of or before the Western encounter. And I totally take the first point that you made about how, I mean, this was particularly in Sri Lanka, about how Buddhism was reconstructed to fit with the West, to be able to sort of demonstrate that it was a rational religion. So this wasn't just something that the Westerners were inventing, it was a mutual interactive process. The question about what I mean by the West, I mean, you know, it's a heuristic device, isn't it? You know, we use language and we use it in a way that's hyperbolic and that doesn't necessarily exactly fit the real world perfectly. So, you know, I'm aware that these categories of West and East and so on are very much more fluid and overlapping, and that we should be careful not to be too essentialist in how we use them. Oh yeah, and what do I mean by world, as in world religion? Well, you know, all I meant was that it's, you know, Buddhism now is in this canon of the 5 or 6 world religions, and that there's been, so, you know, we've heard so much in this conference about the criticism about whether the Asian religious traditions particularly fit within that categorization, that was an invention, arguably, of Christianity, to think about things in terms of discrete religious traditions. This very clear differentiation between the religious and the secular doesn't fit so well. So by world religion, I mean the way in which other religions have been modelled on this sort of Christian version of what a religion should look like or does look like, with founders, with texts and so on. And we heard, yesterday about how that's a really problematic approach to thinking about Hinduism, for instance. And what about economics? Yep, I have certainly, absolutely, really, really important. And similarly, technology. So I've taken Prebisch's concept of the cyber sangha and have a paper actually called Cyber Sisters. So it's about the way in which Buddhist women have appropriated the internet and social media in order to, yes, create a cyber sangha, but also to mobilize transnationally, across traditions, across different countries and so on, in order to mobilize around calls for greater equality for women within the Buddhist tradition. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, technology and social media is absolutely crucial to the changes that are going to be happening within the Buddhist tradition in the future.
Thank you. So I would like now to open the floor for question, or if people who are also following us online, if they have any questions, please ask. Yes. And of course, you need to come here to ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Sergio Della Pergola of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My question is totally naive and totally unprofessional. As someone who does know nothing about the topic. But the question is this: having followed with great interest the debate so far, can we to some extent reverse the causal direction of the relationship that has been, on one hand, religion or broad ideational frameworks of thought influence other things? Can we postulate that at the moment other things do influence these broad frameworks of thought, such as governments of major powers and major economic and industrial corporations, creating new values, and those values percolating into the framework? Some of this, I think, was present in the debate so far. And so if you can sharpen the point, that would be interesting. Thank you.
So you're asking about how states and how business also affects the development of Buddhism, for instance. I mean, one of the really sort of clear things about the Buddhist tradition, as I sort of said at the start of the paper, as it spread to different locations, is that, it's not been like this pure authentic tradition that's been taken to different countries, that all kinds of factors, when it lands in that new place, affect how it's practiced, how it's understood, the significance of it for people. And one of the, the primary features will be the state. And this has been variously reflected in different places. So for instance, in Thailand, Buddhism is one of the three sort of pinnacles of the state. There's the royal family, Buddhism, the Buddhist Sangha, and so on, which are all sort of seen as equally important in terms of how society operates, of the kinds of values that underpin Thai society. And this is very diverse. So I think it's a really good question, but it's impossible just to give one answer because it differs so much between different contexts.
Do you want to? Can you just sit there? Because otherwise the people online won't hear you.
A lot of exercise, right? Just want to add a couple of things. I think that we truly benefit from the approaches and advance in progress of science and technology studies. and critical studies, especially the one regarding the what's so-called digital capitalism. And there are very interesting works conducted by specialists in internet studies, media studies, and so on, regarding the power and the governance, algorithm governance, for instance. And this is brought on the table by technologies, but on the background of huge enterprises. And this is in the case of religion, but nothing to do with Buddhism. But it could be applied to Buddhism. But in this case, this is just a broad theory that Adam Posamai, the isation of society. Adam is a Australian, Belgian, but Australian sociologist of religion, and he has published this really interesting book, The Isation of Society, in which he brings together the influence of capitalistic actors, organization, framing values and framing behavioral models, and the way technologies are in support of this process. This was just something I wanted to add.
I think there was another question. Yes. Yes, sorry. And then I think we'll take this question and then we have a coffee break.
I'm taking this opportunity to make a question to all of you, and precisely with the topic that I would like to insert within this conversation is that I'm a Sanskritist, which is a bad thing in this context, and it's about translation. We have heard that this is something that was there somewhere in the past and spread. The spread, it's about speaking things that he has within and then became visible in terms of words. And therefore today, like sociology, when we sociologists of religion are naive in a way that we do believe that Abhidharma, the word Abhidharma and Dharma has to do with religion something. So this association, which is very strange, it's common sense within sociology today. So because Dharma is the Buddha religion, the Buddha Dharma is the Buddha religion, or the religion of the Buddha. We don't know what to do with the genitive, who is the object, like Christianity. We don't know what that precisely means. I mean, it's the religion of Jesus, of him, from him, as before has been said. And therefore, translation here is like playing in the game of hiding what is presenting. So the Dharma, so in a way, which is the word that we can use to make the case of Buddhism as a religion, apart from, as Tomoko Masuzawa said, of word religion. The invention of word religion implied that we have to make statement on the substance that is behind the word, and we need to have a word to make that statement. But that word could not be Dharma, for example, because it's that nothing to do with any implication of transcendence, as has been said, or to believe in something else, or, I mean, the Buddha itself doesn't sponsor any individuality as a substance. And therefore, translation, again, when we speak about ultimate goal as the place where we go if you are a religious guy, then you get there. And the Paramartha, again, in Sanskrit. And we have the Paramartha, which is translated in English, in French, in German as ultimate truth, which doesn't have to do nothing with the original discourse. So again, as yesterday we were seeing, why we need to have a connection with the past, which is entirely unproblematic. The Buddha was there, he spoke, he said this means this, therefore it is a religion. which is 1850 invention of the world religion phenomena that has to be inserted within a sort of demographical obsession for people claiming to be something through words. So the Paramartha in Via Vara, for example, which could be Max Weber's idea of inner world, out world. How we interpret that? And I think the case of Buddhism for sociology of religion in contemporary context is precisely the place where you have to train yourself to see why we use this word with this naivety that is covering the way we look at the things. It's a question of why translation is so obscurely hidden here from many people, from scholars and people that we interview, as has been said. They are forced obliged to say, I am this, yes, this word has a meaning, and therefore. Thank you.
I understand your question, and actually I've done some Sanskrit in a former life too, so I understand, I think, a bit what you are saying. But I will say that you pronounce the word invention, but everything is an invention at a moment, a time, a space, or another. Not only the word religion. Sociology is an invention for that matter. Science is an invention for that matter. The fact that you say this is a chair, it's an invention and it's a convention, and some other people will not call that a chair, but at one point or another, we need to communicate. So for religion, that's the same thing. I remember I gave a paper to Roberto and about the definition of religion. You remember? It was a special issue about the definition of religion. And I don't remember exactly if it was the title of my article or it was inside my article, but I said the religion is not more difficult to define than a chair. I don't know if you remember. Except that a chair is not that easy, because if it is a little bit different and there's a bit like that, you will say, oh no, it's not a chair. It's actually, I will say in French, I don't know, like a tabouret or a fauteuil or something else. And at the end of the day, you need to know what you're talking about, just to know what you are talking about. And that's the same thing with religion. So that's the reason why, if you have listened to my little talk, I said belief system, and you use the word transcendence. Again, I'm a little bit annoyed with those people that say there is no transcendence, or there is transcendence in Buddhism, there is, etc. Transcendence, if you define it as something that is beyond what you are supposed to see, like right away, there is transcendence in Buddhism. When you're saying Paramartha, I'm sure you were thinking about Paramartha distinguished with Sammuti in Sanskrit. Yes, it's what I thought that, yeah, you can say in a way, if you take it according to Buddhism, it's not really transcendence, etc., etc., etc. But sociologically, in my point of view, it's transcendence, even with all the subtleties that you have in Sanskrit and all that, and you know. So for me, when some people say Buddhists, they don't deal with religion, they deal with Dharma. Okay, but let's take another word, for instance. And you will see how circular it is if we enter into this kind of discussions. Let's take the word philosophy. Exactly the same debate. Is it a philosophy or is it not a philosophy? But of course, if you have beforehand defined philosophy as being this specific structure, this way of thinking that appear specifically at a certain time in Greece, in Plato, and after developed in Aristotle, in different things that happen, you say, this there in Asia is not philosophy. Of course, because you have preemptively defined what is philosophy with a specific history. You do the same with religion, and you say, it's not really a religion, because for a religion there needs to be a god, so to say, etc. Not too precise that there are gods in certain Buddhism, but not exactly the way they are God, etc. That's the same problem with the chair. It's not exactly the chair. No, in fact, it's an armchair. You don't understand, etc., etc. Yes, but because we want to be able to say something in sociology at the end of the day, we decide to start with something quite arbitrary, but life is arbitrary anyway, and everything is at first arbitrary, but you decide. What is not arbitrary is that when you have arbitrarily defined something, after it becomes a logical constraint and you maintain it. So when you say, okay, there is a soteriology, there is a specific collective practice, there are organizations, there are a belief system that suppose a transcendence, etc., you have said that. It's arbitrary, but you say that is a religion, and after you have said that, you can say everything you want. And you don't take your foot into into those debate. Is it a religion or is not a religion? Because those debate regard more our psychological, our social, and sometimes even our intellectual, cultural interests. But if you have precisely defined first, doesn't matter. Other people can say, no, religion is not that. But they have to discuss it, not on the ground that Buddhism is or is not, but on the ground, the definition itself and the logic of the definition itself, in my point of view.
Okay. I was wondering if we could continue this discussion over coffee. One of the very few things I believe in is caffeine, especially in the morning and wine in Italy. So I just want to thank you, our Emma, for her presentation and the discussants and discussion. So we reconvene at 11 for the next panel. Thank you very much.